Was a formal hello to everybody. Hope you can hear me clearly and trust all of you are safe and well despite the uncertain times that we are facing. I'm Rinalini Vasudevan, Assistant Editor at Marg, joining you from Calcutta. And with me today evening, there's Ravi Agarwal from Delhi, Heather Davis from New York, and Rizio Yohannan from Mumbai. Ravi, Heather, and Rizio, just say hi to the audience once.
Hi.
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 Okay, great. So this webinar kickstarts the Marg Salon program. We were meant to have it last Wednesday, and unfortunately, it was postponed because of Cyclone Nisarga, which hit the coastal regions of Maharashtra and Gujarat. And in fact, it's in the context of that cyclone and a lot of other recent developments that we've arrived at this session, which is called Beyond the Anthropocene, because we are looking at pressing concerns around art and ecology. And this is part of a larger series that we've planned, which is called Futures of the Planet and Art Worlds to Come. Of course, at present, our entire concern is devoted towards COVID-19, but there's a much bigger crisis that's been looming over us. This is the ecological crisis. It's been building over a much longer period, and it will continue to have its effects, even as we deal with the more immediate medical emergency, as well as the social, political, and economic side effects that that has had. And so even as we are looking at an overburdened infrastructure, health-wise and in terms of our administration, the plight of migrants, crisis in jobs, our mental health, we are also having to deal with cyclones, locust attacks, forest fires, and a set of other much bigger phenomenon which threatens our survival and the survival of our ecosystems. This, of course, as I said, it's exceptional times in every whit sense. At present, in some ways, the pandemic stands in an ironic position because on the one hand, it's been born from man's exploitation of this natural world. At the same time, it's given that same natural world a space to heal. It's made us rethink the ways in which we live our lives and engage with others. And in that sense, maybe it's slowed down a kind of accelerated process of human activities, which was having its effects on the environment. At the same time, we are not sure to what extent this is actually going to lead us to change our ways and will lead to more sustainable futures. What roles will the arts have to play in that sort of a scenario, and to what extent are they addressing critical questions even at present? To discuss this and more, Rizio, Heather, and Ravi have, of course, planned a great evening of conversations for us. Heather and Ravi have contributed to our March 2020 magazine on art and ecology, and both of them bring with them their own fields of expertise. Ravi is an interdisciplinary practitioner who has worked in the cusp of art and activism. His interests are in photography, writing, curation, and also in environmental justice and citizen awareness. That work he does through an NGO called Toxics Link, which he founded. Heather is a professor of culture and media at the Eugene Lang College, which is part of the New School, New York. She's worked on community art projects and their engagement with politics and ecology. Currently, she's working on a book on plastic and its links with petrocapitalism. We are very pleased to have Heather and Ravi join us. And they'll be addressing questions posed by Rizio, who's the CEO of the Marg Foundation. Before we get started on the session, just a few guidelines for all our attendees. We're dealing with the Zoho platform, which has thrown up its own technical constraints. So this is to ensure that it's a smoother engagement for everyone. One important thing is that, of course, mute your audios to ensure that the speakers can be heard clearly. If there's any problems with video and connectivity, then we suggest you also mute video so that you can at least hear everybody. Um, and when a person's speaking, you will be able to see them at that point of time. You won't be able to see all the speakers in a panel at any given time. So that's there. But otherwise, hopefully, you won't have difficulty, in fact, seeing them. Um, there's also a sidebar on the screen where there are different tabs, and we'd encourage you to look at the Q&A tab to pose your questions. We've got a full house here today. We're really happy with that. So I'm expecting a lot of questions. At the same time, we might not be able to take all questions. So what I'll do is that I'll be keeping a track of the questions that you're posing, and I'm going to be making a selection for Ravi and Heather to address at the end of the first hour. It'll be great when you're posing your question if you mention whether it's for Rizio, Ravi, or Heather. And you'll be able to see only your own question, not the questions posed by everybody else. But at the same time, don't worry. As I said, I'll be looking at everything. And besides that, at the end of the first hour, there's also going to be polls. So 2 questions that we are putting up for everybody to respond to. Yeah. So now I pass on the panel to Rizio, and hopefully this is going to be a good evening of conversation.
Thank you, Mrinalini, and thank you, Ravi and Heather, for joining us, and welcome all of you. It's actually a little strange to do a salon, sitting alone in this room. It's as though I can just see Heather or Ravi now, and nobody else. And it's like I'm looking at Heather and I'm thinking, okay, she's smiling, so it's all right. You never know the 200 people who are attending how they are responding. You're saying something funny, whether it is registering. So it's really a strange kind of interaction. It's also it's also connected to the question that we are discussing, the futures of this planet. So it's very strange also because, as many of you know, Marg is entering its 75th year of continuous publication in October this year. So we've been, for the last year, planning a lot of things around this, like, how do we renew ourselves? It was a time of introspection. We thought a lot about where do we want to go, what are the questions that we should address, all these kind of different questions. And this idea of a salon, a discussion forum, came last year. And our aim was actually to, we had plans about our office, opening our office after hours and, allowing people to come in to have freewheeling conversations and all that. These were the plans, actually on the ground plans, and to have collaborations with different people across this country to have small conversations like this. But now when we are actually launching it, we are launching it online and not really on the ground. And our experience of almost all our senses are like now redundant. Some of us can see each other, but most of you cannot. I cannot see these so many people who are attending. You're in this situation, but the actual salon is where you go and hug people, or you talk to them and all that. But we will certainly do this. Hopefully after this COVID-19 situation. But this salon experience also has 3 phases as we plan it. One is this online webinars. The other is, as I said, the on-the-ground programs that we want to do under this banner. And also, from September 2020 to mark our 75th year, we have reconceptualized our magazine. It's an iconic magazine. This is going to be, it is not just going to be a research and documentation-oriented magazine. It's going to be a breeding ground of ideas, thoughts, along with research and documentation. So it's going to be a new avatar of Marg that you will see in our 75th year. From September that we are launching that magazine. So in the magazine, there is one segment called Salon. which is where 4 or 5 people would come together and discuss an issue. So it's going to be a very vibrant magazine. So when it comes to today's conversation, all these questions of renewal, crisis, continuity, these are all very much part of Marg also at this hour when we are sitting here, when we are launching this new series on, as Mrinalini said, futures of the world and art worlds to come. This sounds quite ambitious. Can any one organization deal with this kind of, it's a large idea, but our founding members of Marg, they had large ideas. They talked about planning and dreaming. They were not talking about research in one specific area. The first editorial by Mulkraj Anand was called Planning and Dreaming. So it was that kind of an organization, Marg, something to show the way. So we take courage from that and inspiration from that memory. And today we are starting this conversation, as Mrinalini beautifully kind of contextualized this. So I don't have to reiterate what we are facing, what is staring at us at this point. But the question is, how do we respond to this? Is there a way in which we can reduce the drastic effects of whatever is happening in the Anthropocene? Is there a way to reverse it? How do we understand it after all? So these are our questions. In this entire series, we'll be discussing these questions. And while we are entering this conversation beyond the Anthropocene, we are specifically looking at what could the arts bring to this conversation. What could the feminist practice of Heather bring to this conversation? So these are some of the ideas that we're exploring in this conversation. I would also like to mention something which has been disturbing me this week. Heather, just before we started, Heather was talking about the protest in the US, which is spread across the world now, and people are joining from all over the place. This week, I listened to two very strong voices in the context of these protests. One is Tamika Mallory, who is a Black rights activist. She had this very impassioned speech, which is like, it's become a viral video going all over and all that. I was listening to her, and one of the things that she said was like, if institutions become draconian, like, they behave like this, you will drive people to mental diseases and they will burn buildings down. So this was a very, very impassioned kind of speech. And another voice which I heard almost the same day was of Candice Owens, who is a Republican mouthpiece, actually. So she had another argument. She said, I don't support George Floyd because have you looked at the history of this man before 2014? He was booked for many crimes, etc., etc. And she asked one question. Why does the Black community have to look at criminals as heroes? Both strong voices, very impassioned. So both messages come to your WhatsApp. So you're listening to it back to back. This is, I don't have to say anything about like where do you go? So can we say that a public validation of burning down of some way of burning down of buildings, can it be justified? Or public validation of non-support of anti-racist protest, can that be supported? So where would you go? So this is the conflict zone where our language has reached us. And it is in this space that we are beginning this conversation. Where do you go from here? How do we understand this space? Because this is this language that we've got, this confusing language that we've got to understand this space. How do you make sense of this? By analyzing this language, distilling the truth from this language, etc., etc. I'll start this conversation with a reference to a book by the latest book. Actually, you all know Harari. He talks about how human beings have always better invented things than using things, And then he says that through the past, till the Industrial Revolution, we have really changed the world, but without understanding the global ecology. So it has resulted in an ecological collapse. But now that is not hissing. After the Industrial Revolution, today we are in the middle of another twin revolution, which is the Infotech and Biotic revolution. So I'll read this sentence from him to open this conversation. He says, in the coming century, biotech and infotech will give us the power to manipulate the world inside us and reshape ourselves. But because we don't understand the complexity of our own minds, the changes we will make might upset our mental system to such an extent that it too might break down. And then he says, the most important problem that we will face in this time is that the common person feels increasingly irrelevant. And it is much harder to struggle against irrelevance than against exploitation. So the question of relevance is very relevant. What is that relevant thing to do is what we are exploring now. What can the arts do relevantly? So I'll start with Heather. Heather, thank you again for joining us. This question is about also in the context of how we are trying to deal with situations in India also. After the lockdown, you've seen what's happening in India, the laborers walking, and all sorts of different things which are going out of our hands. It's just like that ecological collapse or the mental collapse. You can't handle it. You've initiated something, but you can't handle it. But then your attempt to contain this, your attempt to solve this is using an economic paradigm. Like, you think you can actually solve this with an economic solution. But this COVID-19 and this situation has actually, when we are locked down and we are in this room for the last 3 months, we have not even got out, most of us. So suddenly it brings to us this question, can economics really solve all these problems that we are facing in the Anthropocene? Do we need to shift the narrative? Where will you turn to? So my question to you is, do you see, what do you see is the vantage point that we have to shift this narrative, to turn our attention away from this economic paradigm that we've been using for such a long time? Is there another paradigm emerging? Who can start it? It's also a question about the civil society as such. We just talked about this political situation. The majoritarian voice is not, cannot any longer be considered as the civil society's voice, though there are many people there. So the question of, is the majority actual democracy? So these kind of questions, because you also need the support of the people to shift something. So these are related questions. How do you respond to this?
Well, thanks so much for having me here and to be in such esteemed company. I'm really honored and humbled. As you said, I'm located at the moment in New York, and so I feel like from the long traditions of feminist theory that really call on us to speak from our own situated knowledges, I'll really talk a little bit more about sort of North America, or what is known for Indigenous peoples as a Turtle Island. and so I hope there's some kinds of resonances between the context here and the context in India where you guys are. But I do think that part of actually what is necessary is actually this kind of differentiation. So, Rizio, as you were saying, like one of the problems with the economic system is that it's a system both of universalization and of alienation, right? We learn this through Marx and Marxist analysis. By way of, we know the fact that like money can be exchanged for anything, and money is the universal mechanism of exchange. And because of that, there's a kind of flattening that happens through all kinds of different contexts. And even though I think there's been a lot of really interesting work done around how does the Anthropocene allow us to sort of see things in a much larger systems thinking mechanism, for example, really thinking about the earth itself as a large system, thinking about the earth within the frameworks of Gaia theory, for example, that Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock put forward. I think there's also a real necessity to really address things from the places that we are located. And I think in a way that speaks to the question of relevancy that you were posing earlier. I think it's a lot easier for people to address things in their local environments rather than trying to address the global, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't have some understanding of the global, but rather that we really do think I need to be rooted where we are. And one of the theories that I've been finding really inspirational, particularly at this moment in time, is Malina Ranganathan's conceptualization of the environment as freedom. And so in this short piece that she's written, she really puts forward an idea of thinking through the environment in relationship to the Black radical tradition, specifically the Black radical feminist tradition, where we can think about the environment not just as something outside of us, not as this kind of extraneous or external measurement system, but rather as the space and place of freedom itself. And I think that is a really beautiful way of reconceptualizing how we might want to think about ecological conditions. For example, so she quotes Kianga Yamada-Taylor, who describes freedom as the self-determination and self-possession inherent in actual freedom, the right to be free from oppression, the right to make determinations about your life free from duress, coercion, or threat of harm. And this is particularly grave in environmental spheres, as we can see, right? So a lot of the things that, Ravi, for example, you work on in relationship to questions of toxicity, or a lot of the things that we feel like are being imposed on us from the outside, even something like COVID-19, which, many people have linked to questions of habitat loss. That these are things that are enacting upon us a kind of unfreedom, right? A kind of way in which we actually are losing our capability of self-determination and self-possession because of the ways in which we are being imposed upon by chemical companies, industrial manufacturing, and all of these other things that are merely for profit, right? Another thing that I think is really powerful in this moment, and obviously I can't help but think about this at the moment because of what is happening here, is the connections that so many people are making between the sort of one of the rallying cries of Black Lives Matter, and unfortunately the thing that seems to get repeated again and again in the media, which is I can't breathe, and environmental racism or environmental destruction more generally. Despite the fact that clearly those words were spoken in relationship to the specific context of police brutality, I think that they also resonate in environmental circles, right? The rallying call of "I can't breathe" could easily be connected to the recent meltdown of a petrochemical plant. It could also be connected to the history of Bhopal, for example. It can be connected to all of these moments in time when when there have been such kind of intense levels of smog or particulate matter, all of the ways in which we are being asked of us to be put in situations of unfreedom because of the relations to economics and to industrial chemistry and to industrial levels of pollution. So I think that also the movements that we're seeing here that are really coming from the ground, which I think also connect to some of the other long-standing resistance movements in this part of the world. For example, the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in the western part of Canada has been protesting a very large pipeline called the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And they have effectively resisted that pipeline for the past 5 years. I think that all of these mechanisms of resistance are an act of asserting or demanding a kind of freedom. And I think that these are the kinds of things that we need to address. And particularly here in Turtle Island, which sort of encompasses northern North America, these two resistances led from Black and Indigenous people. So I'm thinking of the resistance of the Standing Rock Sioux in Lakota to the DAPL pipeline, or the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and then obviously also the Black Lives Matter movement in relationship to thinking about questions of I can't breathe and the long histories of theory and practice of thinking around questions of freedom, I think really highlight the interconnections of settler colonialism, which in this part of the world is really the heart of capitalism. So if we want to really address capitalism and capital accumulation, we need to be thinking with and through Indigenous and Black theory and practice.
Yeah, Ravi, thank you, Heather, for that. We'll come back to these questions during the conclusion, but let me take this question to Ravi. Ravi, if we have to really make an ecological shift, as Heather says, then it is not only resistance, but there are also these ideas of repair and regeneration, because these have to go simultaneously with resistance. So in a space where you're looking at resistance, repair, and regeneration as in their simultaneity, how do you see the arts? Because you're an interdisciplinary practitioner. Mrinalini has just told everyone about your practice. So you're in a position to look at this, to see how the arts in particular can contribute to this triad of resistance, repair, and regeneration. And also, this also brings us to the question of like how arts have to be, art has to necessarily be connected, as Heather says, these connections are important, connected with other disciplines. Now, for instance, this conversation is enabled by technology. So how do you connect? You also have a science background. So how do you see these things as moving towards perhaps something called a greater ecological connective? How do you see this?
Firstly, thank you, Rizio, for having me here, and Heather, it's great to share the panel with you. I'm really honored to do that with Rizio and Heather both. I speak like a practitioner who's been an activist and an artist in an interweaving kind of way. I've had a long history of activism with working, just trying to save the rich forest in Delhi, then working on the Yamuna and working on toxicity issues, working on environmental justice issues from toxicity, which Heather mentioned about environmental racism and environmental justice issues sort of go together even here in a different language. But I think before we talk of repair, resistance, and regeneration, I think we need to also be careful to think about what is it we are talking about. What are we trying to repair? What are we trying to resist? And I felt the need to act for a long time. I mean, I've been doing this for 35 years. And it's to make a difference of some sort. But also then, what I saw later on is that when the change is so broad, for example, when working with the Tamil fishermen in South India, you see everything around them changing. You see the sea changing, you see the fish catch changing, you see the beach changing, you see the boats changing. When you have such a wide amount of change, you somehow also lose the agency to act, in a sense. It becomes very difficult to act. What should you act with? There's a wave of change. And to rethink of what kind of agency requires you to think differently in some kind of a connected and community manner. And of course, agency is a very complex word, and I was particularly struck by Karen Barad's, who's a new materialist feminist philosopher, talking about intra-agency, where the appearance of agency becomes part of structural systems which interact in very complex ways, and we can apply to the COVID-19 issue as well, that the appearance is not just one interaction between the bat, pangolin, and the human being. It could be the whole system, the sociology of capitalists and systems of labs and logging and pharmaceutical companies, which cause this event to take place. But I think I've been thinking a lot of how to think of the whole way in which we conceive of the environment differently. I mean, as an activist, I know that the word environment came into play around the 1970s after the Stockholm Convention, and then or the Stockholm meeting, and then there was a whole battery of acting against specific individual mediums. So you want to have an air pollution act, or you want to have a water pollution act, or plastic control act, etc. And these are very specific ways of acting. But the interconnection between these things are not recognized in science and policy. So when you make a standard for air pollution, you don't recognize the impact that air pollution will have on the flora and fauna. You don't recognize the connection between air pollution and water, for example, or air pollution and soil. These become very segregated. So somehow the way we have started thinking of the word environment has been great in silos. And unpacking that, if you want to unpack that, you have to see what is the connection, what is the interconnectivity. We keep on talking of codependence, but I think these are very real things. People, anthropologists have started writing about it. They use many words are used like entangled becomings, that the entanglements of the world, and people like Karen Barad, Anna Singh, or Donna Haraway have written about this, that we are not isolated beings. For example, the human being has so many other microbes, almost as many microbes as it has its own cells, in a sense. So this coexistence is not something which is just theoretical. It's actually you can see it in the way we think about it. And the other way of thinking of entanglement is also when I work with the fishing community, for example, taking that example again, then I see that when I'm working with a landscape, the inhabitation of a landscape, it is not a simple inhabitation. It's both cultural, linguistic, political, and it's also got livelihood and capital accumulation all in the same place. Things like labor migration, they're all happening in the same landscape. And it's a very complex entanglement through which this landscape gets produced, through this idea of nature gets produced. And in talking in terms of art, when I took this work of the Tamil Nadu fishermen, I was invited to Havana to do some work there, to have a show last year, and I worked with the local fishermen in Havana for a few weeks. And I found that though they did not understand the language of the Tamil fishermen, when the whole show came together, which was like a collaboration, emotional collaboration, they actually understood. The Cuban fishermen said, "We understand these people. without really knowing, because they have different implements and look different. They both look different, but you understand. So to me, it was like art had created this space of understanding, of a collaboration, of some kind of idea, which there was no other way to do it. So I found that very productive idea of looking at how art can interplay into playing a very special role of creating new collaborations. But also today, if you want to, if you like to think of yourself as an artist, an ecological artist, for example, I think these are not the days of the Spiral Jetty of Richard Serra, which is a beautiful piece. But today we are looking at a very entangled and foundational idea of what nature is. And that nature is caught in a whole history of capital and colonization and technology. And Heather mentioned about how the whole thing gets unified and homogenized, because that's the language through which technology flows. And so when we think of this separateness as it is today, and then we think of an interconnected world, then we have to think differently. We have to create a new language, both of the science of what we're exploring, but also the language of expression, the language of understanding. Because unless we understand it differently, we will not know what to repair. And my fear is that if you just repair in the current trajectory, you're just doing a techno fix. It's like Bill Gates wanting to put geo mirrors on the planet to deflect the sun. Or, so it is on the same trajectory without realizing the specificity of how nature is produced and how nature exists on the ground. And this is it's a big challenge, because it is reconstituting both the understanding and the language through which we express, and a public awareness of that. And in some ways, the artist is the best placed person to do it, because the artist can work in a speculative manner outside of disciplines, and it's the disciplines find it very hard to work in a coordinated way, or in a transdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary word, whatever word you want to use. They have little different meanings, but they find it very difficult, because the academy also, it's not easy in the academy for the people to work in that spheres. So what this post and Anthropocene moment is throwing up for us is this necessity to answer these questions, which cannot be answered in the classical way, but look at new modes of both science, but also of collaborations, which become very essential.
Thank you, Ravi. We will come to this language question that we are talking about after I go to Heather to take that idea of yours and take it to her, the idea of agency. Heather, Ravi mentions this when the rate of change is so much, we lose our agency to act, So I'm coming to you with this question, looking at you as a feminist practitioner. How do you see this notion of agency? And again, Ravi mentioned that it has to be nuanced. The specificities need not be, cannot be. You also mentioned in your earlier talk about the local, that the importance to focus on the local. So the specificity and the local, these are ideas that are coming from both of you. So my question is, do you see that moving towards creating a new language, or towards this new mode of understanding, responding to this, creating something new, where do you see feminism today? Is there a way in which we can go beyond the danger of universalizing, even in the space of feminism? How do you look at this?
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, thanks so much, Ravi, for your comments earlier. So in terms of the questions of feminism, I think that one of the reasons why I've been drawn to feminism in relationship to ecology, I mean, Ravi mentioned so many incredible feminist thinkers like Anna Singh and Karen Barad and Donna Haraway, who are really, really thinking about questions of the environment in really complex ways, but I think that are really grounded in particular places, in particular examples. Taking something that's like maybe fairly small. Donna Haraway talks about this a lot in terms of like, taking a particular object or taking a particular thing and then really kind of unpacking all of its entanglements, right? So you can start from something incredibly small, incredibly local, but really thinking through all of the complexity of how that's rooted in really so many systems in the rest of the world. But one of the things that I think is really incredibly important about feminist thought, to me in relationship to questions of ecology, is because one of the premises of feminism is that it questions the formation of singular narratives. So one of the premises of feminism, at least within the tradition that I've been trained in, is to really question the premise in a single authorial voice. So, the great genius or other kinds of things. And, Ravi was kind of mentioning this in relationship to things like the Smithson piece, moving away from something like the spiral jetty, which might be beautiful, but it's sort of this imposition of a singular vision onto a landscape, towards more collaborative practices. And we see artists doing this frequently. And I think it's because it allows for the kind of complexity of the world to emerge, and to really make yourself vulnerable to the complexity of the world. And for me, feminism does this particularly well because of its relationship to always questioning the formation of singular or universalizing narratives, and instead is always there's a kind of self-reflection in feminist theory and thinking that I think is really vital to what we're doing now, in relationship to, thinking about these kind of questions of repair or regeneration. So, if we are going to be repairing, for whom and under what conditions, and what will that look like, right? I think that feminism has a lot of tools to really think about this kind of, to really pause and rethink those relations, because of the fact that it doesn't take a kind of singular vision for granted. It doesn't take that as its premise of operating. Rather, it takes plurality as the premise of operating from the beginning. Also, I think that there's something in feminist thought that I think is really important about the kind of modalities of care and caretaking, which are often feminized roles that are done by women. And I think that is incredibly important, because I think if we shift our understandings from thinking about our relationship to the environment as one of imposition or control, domination, containment, all of these kinds of things that I think are very pervasive in our language and our orientation, particularly through industrialism and through the history of recent technologies. If we think about that and shift towards more of a caretaking role, I think that there is a way to be able to rethink some of our relations to the environment. And that also, I think it draws attention to some of the ways in which the things that COVID has brought up, I'm not sure if it's played out the same way in India, but here there's a real highlighting of who is necessary and who isn't, right? Like we actually have necessary workers, and a lot of those necessary workers are the people who are doing this kinds of caretaking practices. And so I think, shifting towards asking, like, what is a caretaking practice? How do we foster the health of communities and ecologies, I think are really at the heart. The other couple things I would say about feminist practices, one, in relationship to questions of feminism and queer theory, is that in queer theory, there's been a real exploration of the relationships of thinking about kinship beyond the nuclear family. So, because for so many LGBTQ people, a family structure isn't something that we can necessarily take for granted, that, often people have to find their own kinds of family structures because their family of origin, in many cases, rejects them. It means that there's a real wealth of kinship making beyond the kind of families that you're born into, that come out of the lived realities of queer lives. And what's been really interesting about this in the past 10, 15 years or so, is that a lot of people who are working in these areas have begun to think about this in relationship to the other than human. So how is it that we can begin to think about the other than human world as the place of kinship? Like, what if we thought about plastics, for example, as a form of human kin? What if we thought about mosquitoes as a form of human kin? Like, how would that shift our relations? Those aren't necessarily easy relations. They're not necessarily relations that you always want. But I mean, I think the reason why the notion of kinship or family, I think, is a powerful metaphor here, is because of the ways in which, often our families aren't necessarily easy or always healthy, right? So that we're bound together regardless. We're bound together to form modes of responsibility together, and to really sort of think through, what does it mean to really be responsible to and for both the things that we are creating and the worlds in which we are embedded and that we're entangled in, as Ravi was pointing out. That these aren't just abstract questions, but they literally recompose our bodies in different ways. The ways in which we think about the world literally has material impacts on the world, which then literally recomposes the bodies that we actually have. So I think all of this is really asking us to think about new modes of relationality. And, in particular, I often think with or have deep respect for the kinds of long traditions of indigenous thought that have been doing this in much better ways than the Western tradition. And have been really have deep and serious practices and systems of governance based around questions of relationality, and thinking through reciprocal relations and what does it mean to have to be responsible to plants and animals and bacteria and rocks and the wind. And if we were thinking about being responsible to and caretaking for those other beings, how would that completely shift our notions of what does it mean to be in the world? And just one other little comment, just to say that I do think that art at this moment in time is one of those privileged places to be able to work out these new modes of relationality. I do think that it has this potential to reconfigure, and in part because I think it also affects us on an emotional level. It's something that we connect with, not just through our intellect, but through our bodies and through our hearts and through our emotions.
Yeah, thank you for this, Heather. But because you're talking about relationality, I just want to add a quick question here before I go to Ravi. This is about responsibility. Like when you're talking about caregiving, caretaking, these kind of terms which are coming into play for long in the anthropocentric world, you have an assumption of responsibility. I assume responsibility of something else. The question which both of you are asking, and the critique of the repair, and asking this question of for whom is the repair. So that I think is very important. So when it comes to the question of responsibility in this scenario, do you think there needs to be a re-understanding of the term responsibility itself in this context?
Well, so Donna Haraway has taken responsibility and parsed it, right? I don't know if you've seen this, but it's instead of responsibility in the regular way in which it's spelled in English with the I, she puts it into two words, which is response and then ability. So basically, the ability to respond. So thinking through what are the kinds of things, what are the kinds of practices, theoretical trajectories that we need to be able to more capably respond, right? And I think that what she means by that is not the kinds of responses that Ravi was alluding to in relationship to these kinds of, like Elon Musk or these other kinds of techno-utopian people, but rather really thinking about what are our responsibilities to our immediate kin, right? Like what is our responsibility to the rats in New York City, right? What is our responsibility to the kinds of species that live here, to particular types of trees or plants, right? I think that one of the things that I find useful for thinking about like indigenous governance systems is that people think of themselves in relationship to a particular plant or a particular animal, and that it is their responsibility not just for the caretaking of themselves, but they understand that their well-being is intimately tied up with the well-being of a particular plant or a particular animal. And if that particular plant or particular animal is harmed, that they understand that they themselves are harmed. And so I think that I think it's that kind of a responsibility that we need to be cultivating, rather than you're right. I mean, I think that also these terms have also been used to really think about a kind of top-down intervention where humans are still put at the top of the kind of spectrum of being. But rather, like, what does it mean to kind of cultivate responsibility if we understand that our bodies themselves are only very partially human, and that actually the majority of our cells are bacteria, and there's all kinds of other amazing things about how mRNA from the plants and animals that we eat actually attach themselves to our genetic code and then alter the ways in which that code gets expressed. So there's ways in which we are literally our surrounds, and I think that trying to think through that in relationship to questions of responsibility is really the task ahead of us, even if that is a fairly large and daunting one.
Thank you, Heather. Ravi, I'm taking this question to you also. If you remember the last 2 weeks, there have been a lot of discussions around something which happened in Kerala. An elephant eating a pineapple filled with firecrackers and blowing itself up. And there was a lot of rage about this. And then there was a statement from the forest department that the locals use this method to scare away the wild boars that come and attack the village and create a lot of destruction. There's just accidentally that the elephant ate this, or it found the pineapple and it just ate this, and this happened. And when the elephant died, there was this uproar, but there are hundreds of wild boars lying in those villages every now and then because this is a common practice. So as Heather was mentioning, how responsible are we to the rats of New York? That kind of a question. So we are in the same thing that the same question of confusion. When we are talking about, we are confronting two voices like Tameka's and Candice's voices. The same way, you are also in when you encounter this, you are in a state of confusion. You don't know how to really judge. Where do you go? But when we listen to Heather, we understand that the feminism as a space, a philosophy, as practice, it has evolved its methodologies over time to think this through, tools to think this through. But today, we are in a space where the entire rage of, I bring this question because the rage about this elephant dying was all seen on the social media. Where normal people, everybody was responding to this. Everybody was saying something about this. So there was a kind of, some time back, before the social media revolution, you had a certain methodology worked out by the arts or academics. Like each discipline had a certain methodology to respond to certain things, because we are also talking about responsibility as the capability to respond in a responsible manner. So while on the social media you have this outpouring of things, knee-jerk reactions, but it also creates a lot of upheaval in the society, because that is what we are seeing, especially in a time of lockdown. More than actual news, you're seeing your WhatsApp and your social media. These things come to you first on Twitter and WhatsApp. So you also start reacting. You immediately put a comment there. You don't have a methodology to think this through. So in this kind of a space, how do you understand the arts? Do you think because everybody is responding, do you think the vision, the material, the media of the arts must change now? You already talked about a new language and a new mode which has to emerge. Can you reflect a little more about this in this context?
So I'm to also take your elephant question further and to think about it in terms of how I think about it in terms of the layers of invisibility which happens. So the traditional fisherman becomes invisible. The fish become even more invisible, and the wild boar is a vermin, does not require there, so it needs to be eliminated. So these layers of structures of power through which everything gets classified, and it's in the media reports it was mentioned that the elephant was doing no harm. It was just going through the fields and it was pregnant. So I'm all for elephants, so don't get me wrong. But suppose the elephant was rampaging the fields for food, would you have the same response? So it's would you have the same response to a tiger, but to a man-eating tiger? We have a totally different response within the same species as well. So we have drawn up idea of what is desirable for us and what is not desirable for us, and then we create narratives around that. But the world is actually much more complex, because this is also in the historically how the whole ecosystems has been made has become damaged. For example, Arugyoti Sakya in his new book, The Unquiet River, talks about how millions of hectares of land were cleared in Upper Assam or Assam for tree plantation. And this is where the elephants lived. So we have gone through such a history of 200-300 years of complete decimation of all habitat, that the only way we can deal with it is in the way Bill Gates suggests that you deal with it, or Elon Musk talks about going to Mars. We have no other language left to deal with it. So that is the reason it's so difficult to think of the post-Anthropocene in real terms, because it means a great reconstitution of, as I said earlier, of both our language and our agency to think of what constitutes something out there. But also that the question to me is, what should we do? So I think that one of the postures we have towards nature is about power and control. That and you see that in the rivers, you see in the way we think about nature, we think in the way we think about even events like cyclone. Is about power and control to the extent you can, and if you can't, then you cope with it in a sense. So this thing of power and control is a positionality vis-a-vis something. It's some kind of a power positionality. So when, like Heather mentioned about indigenous peoples and about economies of reciprocity, where indigenous people will take part of a plant, not the whole plant, because they know they have to come back to it. So of reciprocity and care, how do we start acknowledging them as something which is important? And I think this requires a basic shift in the way we approach. We have to go into a mode of listening, of our decolonization of the way we think, of the way we know, or we have been the language and both a treatment of something else. So we have got rid of the actual colonies, but we still have a colonized view of the world. You can see the hierarchies through which we deal with the world, and the world changes very dramatically. Depends what the social hierarchy gets imprinted on the idea of nature. So, like Mukul Sharma writes about caste in green, talks about the relationship which a Dalit person might have to to the forest might be very different than what a Brahmin might have to a forest. So these are very different ways in which the world gets conceived and produced. So before we talk about creating a larger sense of something, a larger way of change, we start listening. But listening is not easy. This is also epistemological shift. It's because the relationship of the indigenous person to the forest is as a different self than what the self you and I might inhabit. And so it's culturally a different self, but also the knowledge of what is happening, where you're operating from. So it's a big shift to actually get into the mode of listening. And I think even if we adopt this mode of listening, then this idea of care for rats or the care for viruses, because they're already there. And Anna Singh writes in one of her edited essays in her book on learning to live on a damaged planet about how new biology is not talking of the vertical tree of life, but talking of horizontal gene transfers, that genes are constantly being transferred between different species. It's not like we are the apex species. So if we think of the world in a different way, reconceive of the world, it actually shifts our position from one of arrogance to one of listening. And then how do you listen with care and listening with understanding? What do you do after you listen? Suppose I invite all the multiple knowledge systems to a table. What do I do with those knowledge systems? How do I take it forward? What's the next step? What kind of governance systems will evolve from that listening, from this post-human, post-Anthropocene and post-human, actually, idea of the world where the more than humans or the non-humans, whatever word you want to use, have equal agency, and it becomes an ethical question as well. So, with if you talk of agency, if you talk of responsibility, you cannot avoid the word ethics. So we have to be in that ethical questioning of both of realizing that if we kill all the microbes, we will not survive because we are actually physically dependent on them, but also because we can destroy it doesn't mean we should destroy it. And there are scores of examples how we have destroyed landscapes. You can look at the ecological history of rivers, from the Rhine to the Ganga to the Brahmaputra to the Mississippi. You can see these large histories, these important histories, where how whole systems, through the language of universal language of capital and technology, they were flattened out, and the people who lived along them, they were made marginal to their own lives and own landscapes. And you can also say this is one of the causes you're creating poverty by doing that. So it is a reconfiguration, but I think that it is possible to do, because we have to feel that. I really sometimes feel that if climate change solutions were within the grasp of the techno-engineering capitalist framework, we would have already been there, gone there. The current data is showing we will not go there. We will have a big spillover in this century of climate change. So we really need to reconfigure from this trajectory to another trajectory. And that other trajectory is what I think Heather is hinting towards, what I'm hinting towards, that unless we have that shift, the post-Anthropocene will just become the artificial intelligence, where the human becomes even more unified as the idea of the human, and technology takes over. That's where we're heading right now, I fear.
Yeah. I think, Ravi, what you're ending with is like, it's not just a question of talking about reconfiguring, but I think our understanding of language itself, we traditionally say language is a means of expression and communication, but now you're saying language is a means of listening. It is not just to speak out, but it is also to listen. So that aspect of language, it's very interesting that when we are discussing this towards the end of this conversation, we have a lot of questions, so we will have to close this now and start the questions. But when a deer and a tiger, they cohabit, And when the tiger feels hungry, it eats the deer, but there is no moral dilemma. So, because it is perhaps listening to its own body, its own hunger, and only does what is required, to sustain, and not extra things, to destroy for the sake of destroying, as you say. So this question of listening to understand what is required, what is the necessary thing, and just do just that, is also the question of relevance that I started this conversation with. What is the relevant act that we need to resort to at this particular point? So on that note, I think we should start the questions, but I also want to tell this audience that this is a series of conversations. And from this question, it's exactly next week, on 17th, we have a webinar. I hope all of you would join that. This is a question on language. And the question of language that we are taking up is exactly this. What is language an extra gift which is given to human beings to speak out, or is it something else? So this question is explored by philosopher and historian Rohit Goel and contemporary dancer Padmini Chetur. I hope you will all join. The posters will all go out tomorrow. So I would request Mrinalini to start the question answer session at this point. There is also a poll which the audience can respond to, which Chetan has initiated. Thank you, both of you. I'll come back to close, but Mrinalini, over to you.
Okay. Thanks for that great conversation, Rizio, Ravi, and Heather. So one question we have, there's a question that's been sent by Abhishek Matta. I'll read out the question, and I think it's best if Ravi responds to this. So Abhishek's asking that in our contemporary moment, where borders are becoming stricter. This is national borders, conceptual borders, disciplinary borders, human and natural borders. How do we reimagine a sphere of justice and ethics that's not tied to the limited notion of sovereignty, of nations and of selves? And in what way can art enable us to extend our boundaries of justice and sovereignty? So that's a question, in fact, for Ravi. I have a question for Heather. Now, does Ravi want to take his question first and then I ask Heather? Yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah, I have a short.
Yeah.
I have a short response to that we have to look for new collaborations, not only across borders, but across everything else, across species, across other life forms. We have to look for new collaborations, because the borders we have created are also boundaries of what we think the separations are. But actually, we are talking of entanglements, and entanglements required recognition of entanglements and then creating collaborations across the field. And I think the only way we can dissolve these borders is to reconfigure how we know something. It's not by attacking the borders themselves. The borders are an outcome of a certain way of thinking, of a certain way of protectionism about something, a certain way of separateness. And I think what we're suggesting is not to be in the separateness mode, but not to be in a more entangled way of understanding.
Okay, all right.
And that that's true for the arts as well. Artists require new collaborations across different spheres.
Okay. So keeping what you've just mentioned, Ravi, I actually had a question. It popped up right at the beginning, in fact, when Heather started her discussion. This is actually addressed to Heather, but of course, Ravi, you can come in if you want to, which is this whole idea of addressing the local over the global. And currently what we're seeing, of course, is that on the one hand, as you've been talking about, there's this issue of borders, you've been talking about collaborations, etc. The current moment of crisis is one where we're seeing that actually things like, interaction, travel, especially one that's enabled on a kind of global scale, is one that's been affected. And even within countries, what's happening is that more and more people are returning to villages, homes, or staying, within smaller spaces. In this sort of a situation, I see how anyway there's a kind of move towards the local over the global. Will it actually help in terms of ensuring in some ways a kind of a greater sustainability if then we all turn inwards? And in some sense, is that going to, literally every country and ecology and ecosystem sort of looking for themselves in terms of sustenance? Because if you go to a lot of indigenous peoples and knowledge, indigenous people are very rooted in their own space. Indigenous people do also travel, but not to an extent in which today, say, it's been enabled by airplanes and general kind of across, I go from country to country in a day and things like that. So does it actually help to stay in one place and get to know the environment better and try and improve on that? And in that sense, is it going to help if all of us turn towards the notion of a local over a global? This is actually to Heather, but as I said, Ravi can also kind of muse on that.
Yeah, I would say that, that old adage from the environmental movement, think globally, act locally, is still very pertinent to the kinds of things that we really need to be thinking through. And I think in part because what this moment is really asking us, the kind of ethical turn that really is this epistemological turn that Ravi is indicating, I think in order to be able to do that with any kind of real depth, is that you do have to dedicate yourself to a particular place. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be moving around or talking to each other. I'm definitely not saying that we should have that kind of insularity in our thinking, or even necessarily in our actions, but rather that being grounded or embedded in a particular location, I think does allow for the kind of complexity of the world to actually emerge. I think that, when we're moving around so quickly, it's very difficult to get a sense of what is important in a particular location. I also think that there's some very practical things too that are related to this, which is questions of consumer supply chains, for example, right? There's huge amounts of energy that is spent shipping things back and forth across the world, that have all kinds of ramifications for ecologies and for human health. For example, like on the west coast of Canada, I heard once that a lot of the fish that was caught there was then shipped to China for processing and then reshipped back to the west coast of Canada, where people would buy it, just because it was cheaper to do that because of the different rates of pay in those two countries, which doesn't help anybody, right? It's not helping the Chinese workers get better working conditions. It's not helping the amount of oil that is being produced. So I think that regrounding ourselves in a sense of the entanglement of the local, I think allows us to resist both the kind of insularity of the kinds of rhetorics of nationalism and sovereignty that you were bringing up before, but that also allows us to do justice and to really develop methods for ethical responsibility to the creatures and beings with whom we share the world.
Okay. Thanks so much, Heather. Another question that's been posed, this is by Rose Maria Reggie Matthew. This is actually something which has been in discussion. In fact, Amitabh Ghosh, of course, has dealt with it at length in his book. But the question is, how does the Anthropocene reflect itself in literature? Again, this could be answered by Heather or Ravi, but maybe even Rizio, because Rizio herself, in fact, is been very involved in writing, literature, translation. So Rizio, would you want to take that, or would the others also want to contribute to that?
I can take that, but I would like to actually Ravi and Heather to respond more to other questions. But to respond quickly, I think the question of literature itself is not, we are not looking at literature as a category which is very regimented now, because it is a very fluid space, So, and we know that there are a lot of writings, Atwood's in the year of the flood, too, in Kerala, like Sarah Joseph writing about Allah Hedap and Makal, which is really showing that the effect of how where things are going. So there is no point in enumerating the number of books and poetry and fiction, things which have come out about all this. We know that, but I think it's what when it comes to the question of literature. What I think is to actually note the fluidity that it is acquiring now. It is actually about trying to go out. The literature as a genre itself, as an expression itself, is trying to break out of those categorical space. So I think that structural movement is what has been was influenced. I think the writers now who are actually trying to push the boundaries of literature as a genre of writing, as an expression, is what is the most important reflection of how we are responding, how literature is responding to the Anthropocene. Not particular writings is innumerable. So I think the structural movement has to be understood more clearly. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Another question that's been brought up, actually, it's been like in a series of comments which have been posed by Shubhra Jyoti. This is related to the discussion again about the death of the elephant in Kerala and what Ravi was actually talking about. But his idea is that, of course, while the immediate focus is on the elephant, of course, there's actually a much larger system here at play, which involves, in fact, farmers, man, nature, conflict zones, and then, in fact, exploitation and accountability. And in some ways, in fact, as I said, we are on the one hand, in fact, extremely dependent on farmers and the kind of subsidized agriculture, in fact, that enables us to get our food. On the other hand, the very fact that there are those subsidies means that there are many ways in which farmers themselves cannot protect their own crops or, in fact, the nature that's there around them. So it's a much larger system of exploitation that you're looking at. So the very question that Ravi raised, which is essentially about, in fact, hierarchies, and which we often fail to see because any one thing is brought into focus and the larger picture is not made available. In this sort of a situation, what would be, what are ways in which we could make these hierarchies and interconnected systems much more evident? I don't know, would you be able to, Ravi, I think you can see the comments yourself also. Would you be able to respond to that?
I mean, I can't see the question per se. I'm sure somewhere here are many questions I can see. But in terms of making it visible is something I said to learn to listen. There are many ways of listening, including the questions you ask of your research. For example, if you're trying to figure out the web of life, the ecosystem, how it exists, or that's one way of knowing better how the interdependencies work. But also through a historical perspective of something that, looking at the history of what is being said and the systems which then, the systems of revenue, taxation, and land and pricing, which then give effect to the current systems. There's been so much written about how revenue changes made huge impacts on land use. On rivers, who got settled, what got grown. This whole history of jute talks about how jute was promoted as an export, and then how it was made, or tea, for example. Tea was, the land for tea was given at a great concession, almost free, and then tea had no taxation. So these human systems which have caused this is something you can see that these are constructed and created systems, to the extent that you come to a point where you can react to it no other way except looking at it as a crisis. But the crisis is not a crisis of the moment, the crisis in the making is both a historical crisis and epistemological crisis at hand. So when we try and reverse that, you have to find some way to start unraveling that thread. And the question is, what do you? So I suggest listening as a mode of unraveling that thing that I don't know, I have to figure out. It's not what appears. It's a question you can start. So there have been so many cases where animals have become extinct because they were declared vermin, for example. The wolf in Scotland, disappeared because it was declared, because they wanted to raise sheep farming there, because of the highland clearances, and they killed the wolf because the wolf is not very good for sheep farming. So this history of exterminations, history of classifications, history of land use have been very politically and in a power structure. The highland clearances were when the poor were thrown out in Scotland, when people from England, the nobility from England came and took over that. And it's interesting to say that the kilt is a modern invention. The kilt is not Scottish more than in the 20th century. So all these myths which we have inhabited as something which we take as gospel truth actually are historically and politically embedded. And I think there's no easy way but to find out, to explore, and to come to a space where you understand something better. You cannot take the world at face value. You have to deconstruct and rethink and inform yourself. There's no easy way of doing it, I feel. And in this whole thing I call listening, is to get into a mode where you need to know rather than need to say. And how do you get in a need to know? What language, what barriers do you have to jump? What understandings you have to create? What language barriers might be there? Cultural language barriers. For example, when I was working with a Tamil fisherman, the question constantly came to me, is the sea I see the sea he sees? Because both the sea, but his relationship to the sea is completely culturally different than mine is as an urban person. So those are very difficult things to overcome. But if we don't overcome them, we'll never understand something differently.
Okay. Ravi, returning to actually one of the first questions you answered, this is a question actually which is in relation to this idea of collaboration. In terms of what often this very idea of collaboration, in fact, even though as a term it seems something which is very egalitarian and equal, often there is a hierarchy and a kind of power structure to it. And very often, arts and crafts almost become guilty of that. In fact, instead of creating a more equal system, it continues a kind of power structure. What we often find is there are artists, in fact, who have, say, grown up and been educated outside a community, but then who choose to come and live within the community and then somewhere interact with them and the ecology over there and try and build something out of that. Does that, it's to what extent, in fact, is collaboration often still falling into that same trap of a power structure, especially in relation to a lot of contemporary art that's now dealing with ecology? So that's and again, Heather, both of you actually should.
I'll just say one line and I let Heather take it,
okay.
Just because I think she has a lot to say on this. But I just want to say one line, that the word community and collaboration fall in the same trap of this, what we sort of think it is, but it comes with all the challenges which are there in what we're saying, unpacking the power structures. It comes with all those challenges. I don't say it with any kind of ease, but as the only way forward. But I'll let Heather.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question really circles back to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, right? Which is that I agree that I think that collaboration is really the only way forward, but that if we don't address the kind of power imbalances between each other, between our different types of positionality, that we're only going to end up replicating the same kinds of systems that are already in place. I mean, how to sort of practically undo those things, I think, is quite difficult. I really appreciate the ways in which Ravi is formulating this in relationship to questions of listening, so that, you know, people who are in positions of greater power are asked to be listening, both to the other than human world around us, and also to other people who don't occupy those same kinds of positions. I mean, I do think that there is a lot of, you know, I mean, the art world is a big and complicated world, and there's all kinds of different people out there who are acting in very different ways, right? It's very non-homogeneous in the ways that Rizio is bringing up in relationship to literature, right? One could say the same thing about the visual arts. There's just such a myriad of practices that stem, I think, from people who have really ethical ways of doing things to people who seem to be doing things just because it's catchy or trendy, or they want to gain a certain kinds of status. So, I mean, if you know, there's just such a gambit of things, but I think that this kind of modality of listening, a modality of humbleness, a modality of asking after for whom and why, I think is some of the central questions that any project has to really grapple with. And I think that these are centrally important to really redressing some of the questions of collaboration and power imbalances that have historically really marked the relationship between community arts and, for example, and collaborators. And I also think that, but I think that these things aren't necessarily simple. I think, you know, people can come from the outside. And if they really engage with the communities and they really stick around and they really actively hold themselves accountable and responsible to the people that they are working with, and use their power and privilege that's often gained from the outside to enable to lift up other people, I think that there can be really interesting modes of working, but I think it's not simple, it's not straightforward, and these things often have to be worked out in context.
I think
Right.
we've come to a kind of end of this thing, because we've just 1 minute to end the webinar. So I think there are a lot of questions.
There's been a lot of questions,
Yeah.
and the thing is, there's one. In fact, we've been running two polls also. So one general question was, in fact, about whether an ecology-based model of governance, in fact, would be preferred over an economic one. And the resounding result seems to be most people think yes. At the same time, in fact, SEBI has raised the question about, you know, how it seems very ideal, that notion, but whether world forces will actually be able to come together to break market-driven forces, which have been built over such a long period. So that's in fact something maybe we can just close with this question. Yes.
I think these are questions which we will have to really, continue discussing, and
Right.
we will continue to discuss this in the series. And thank you, Ravi and Heather, for being here and this wonderful conversation. We're taking home a lot of ideas, and this will really help us as we go forward, because, as I said, we are really moving towards a new Marg. In September, we will see a new avatar of Marg. So I would request all the members of the audience also to be with us, join this journey as we go forward. Thank you everyone for joining us. And Runali, you would like to quickly close and
Yeah, just again, a huge round of thanks to everybody for making this a really stimulating session, and of course the importance of listening, which both Ravi as well as Heather have emphasized. And of course, as Rizio also said, there's going to be more talks in the Marg Salon program, and you can look forward to another one on June 17th, where Rohit Goel and Padmini Chetur will be in conversation. A lot of the discussions that have come up today are actually, they've been already also part of a set of essays that have come out in the Art and Ecology magazine, edited by Ravi, Agarwal, as well as Latika Gupta. And it's available on the Marg website. The digital version is available. Unfortunately, we've not been able to print copies as yet, but we hope to be making print copies available as soon as the presses are running. And please log into the Marg Facebook and Instagram pages for further updates on our events and publications. And look forward to your continuing support and all these interactions. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Mrinal.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.